and I'll be going over the review session on Monday. Of course, it's not, attendance is never obligatory because we're all adults, right? But I'll be on Monday reviewing the basic themes that are most important for the questions being asked on the final. So it'll probably be helpful for the final. Today I want to talk about the changes that occurred in the United States as a result, or during and possibly as a result of the United States, of World War II. Seems too loud. So Roosevelt knew that there was going to be another war, basically in 1938. He also was convinced that he was the only person who could conceivably lead the country. But he also knew that he could not announce he was running for a third term because that violated had become a sacred aspect of American politics. After 8 years, you were out. You retired from public life as president. So he simply studiously avoided the question. He never said that he was going to run for re-election. He also never said that he wouldn't run for re-election. And behind the stages, he made sure that nobody declared their candidacy in the Democratic Party. So when the convention, Democratic Party convention, met, when it opened, nobody knew who was going to be nominated, and one of the first things that happened was that Roosevelt sent word to the convention that he did not want to be nominated for a third term. And the response was disappointment. As the proceedings wore on, Roosevelt's campaign people orchestrated supposedly spontaneous, but actually not, outbursts of the chant, "We want Roosevelt." And each time, more and more of the delegates took up the chant, and finally the entire convention hall took up the refrain, and delegates snake danced up and down the aisles chanting, "We want Roosevelt, 4 more years." And then they voted almost unanimously to offer Roosevelt the nomination. He had wanted it to appear as if it had been a spontaneous draft. And after mulling it over, appearing to have mulling over the offer, he reluctantly agreed to run for a third term only out of a sense of duty to the country. The Republicans nominated Wendell Willkie, who in fact had been a Democrat, who had switched parties because it was clear that no one was going to be allowed to run for the Democratic Party nomination. He was a successful industrialist who had become a vocal critic of the New Deal, but he was also an internationalist, and he had written a book called One World that argued that the United States could no longer stand apart from the world but had to lead it, and then in fact reshape the world to fit American priorities. And he ran on a campaign of harnessing American business towards the militarization of the nation so that they would be prepared to, the country would be prepared to stand up to Hitler. Roosevelt preempted the defense issue by rapidly expanding military and naval contracts. Workers streamed into new factories to build these new orders, much of it being sent to Britain, Russia, and China. Unemployment rates dropped dramatically for the first time, going down below 10% since the beginning of the Great Depression. Roosevelt spoke of preparedness, but he presented himself as a person who would do whatever he could to keep the country out of war, even though we know that he was absolutely convinced that the United States would have to go to war, and much of his policies after he was reelected were directed towards creating a situation where the United States would be brought into both the Asian and European conflicts. But he promised in his campaign that your boys are not going to be sent into any more foreign wars. Now, Roosevelt knew this was true, but he also knew that events would take their own course and that the public, which was possibly much of it apathetic, many people, many others opposed for a variety of reasons to getting involved in the war, and only a relatively small minority really gung-ho to get involved, and perhaps understanding why it was important. So the 1940 election was fought between two men who both believed that the future of the world depended on U.S. leadership, and that future would be established through how the United States operated once it entered the war. And that U.S. leadership of the world required militarization and the formation of a standing army capable of projecting itself across the globe. This was the single most dramatic transformation of 1940, this consensus that the United States should have a large standing army. It wasn't a consensus that the general public shared, but it was a consensus among elite political leaders. Since the Civil War, the United States had had literally the smallest military force of any industrialized nation. It was 17th in size in 1940, and thus was actually smaller than the militaries of many countries with much smaller populations and economies, countries that weren't even really industrialized. It was, as I was arguing last time, one of the anomalies of the United States' position in the world. It was already the world's leading financial and industrial power. Its policies had long shaped and reshaped the world, often as the country addressed its internal concerns. When we began this course, I stressed the importance of agricultural policy and the effort to strengthen the ability of farmers to get their products onto a world market spurred the rapid expansion of railroads, a second industrial revolution focused on heavy machinery and durable consumer goods, and this led to cheaper food all over the world and migration of millions of displaced farmers from all over the world who could not compete with the efficiency of the American farmer. The impact of the U.S. on global economy, economics, and politics continued to grow as the U.S. became the world's largest industrial producer, the greatest financial power, and the most important source of popular culture, including new methods for advertising and selling goods. Most other nations of the world misjudge the ill fit between American economic power and its comparative military weakness. In that sense, that's why I was saying last time that Pearl Harbor was an event waiting to happen. If it hadn't been Pearl Harbor, there would have been something else similar. We know that Japan's military leaders, in particular, understood very well that over the long haul, the Japanese armed services could not defeat the United States, particularly if American industrial power were turned decisively towards war production. But they viewed the United States as essentially a commercial power interested in money, first, second, and third, and if it had any time left over, it would worry about money, fourth and fifth. And it had no stomach or expertise in fighting. no tradition comparable to what held together the Japanese military and presumably how the Japanese ruling class viewed itself. They assumed that a quick, decisive attack on American interests in Asia and the West Pacific would lead to negotiations rather than continued fighting. Hitler also shared Japan's contempt for American military potential. Transcriptions of his general staff meetings that were published in the 1990s show that he had little understanding of the United States as a society. Hitler accepted, without question, a whole host of stereotypes. Naturally, American leaders were interested only in money. The American people were racial mongrels and interested only in satisfying their physical pleasures. Both elites and commoners would collapse quickly when faced with the steely determination of the reborn Germany. Americans would prefer negotiations and some face-saving conclusion to war, particularly if that was the best way to secure access to the new European market that Germany intended to create. He continued to spout these ideas right up to April 1945, when the Soviet army was at the gates of Berlin and the American army had already occupied all of Western Germany and was heading into the eastern sector. Given these misperceptions of the United States, something like Pearl Harbor was inevitable, and Roosevelt knew that military weakness and confusion about within the U.S. about its place in the world invited attack. Given U.S. policies towards both Japan and Germany that Roosevelt was pursuing, it required little imagination that war was only a matter of time. But most American citizens did not have that level of imagination because they had grown up in a society that was self-proclaimedly pacifist. A commercial society that did not spend money on the military, that wanted disarmament, that just wanted to live within its own borders, supposedly. So the war was going to have to be an education for them. The election of 1940 articulated a consensus amongst political elites that the policy of relying on the Atlantic and Pacific as the first line of defense was already outmoded, and they both advocated more active engagement with the world, and they both were ready to build up an intimidating military force, but they, in the process, had to retrain the American people to learn to live in a new kind of society, a society in which war and preparedness was going to be much more part of everyday life, and the federal government was going to move from the side of the stage, social stage, to take center stage as the master orchestrator. The military at the beginning of 1940 was slightly under 100,000. By 1941, it had grown up to 1.5 million. By 1942, it went to 4 million, and by 1943, it was 8 million. This kind of growth would tax any organization, but especially one that had not been organized historically to be able to handle that size of level of personnel. Now, I thought I would show you an amusing film.